Our very next talk is The Cost of an Incident by Amanda Draeger. Please give her a very warm ShmooCon welcome.
Good evening and welcome, and thank you for actually showing up to this. Now, when you read the obligatory biography, you might have seen that it said I was a cyber risk engineer, and you're like, what on earth is that? I've never heard of that job description. Because let me tell you, I hadn't heard of that job description either until I started doing it. Short answer is that when you're dealing with cyber insurance, you're mostly working with a broker who's working with an underwriter, and that underwriter is not actually a cyber expert. Shocking, I know. They are an insurance expert. So a cyber risk engineer is the actual cyber expert that helps the underwriters out and do their jobs. And so that is what I do. Now, what we're going to talk about today are some of the things that I've learned on that job as we look at cyber incidents and claims as they come into companies like mine. Obligatory legal disclaimer, the really important thing that I want you to note here is that I'm going to make some comments about what tends to appear in coverage for cyber insurance. I'm not saying that these things are not covered under any policy. I'm not saying they're not covered under your policy. I am making broad general statements. So, with that in mind, one of the biggest challenges we as a field face is how do we convince our organizational leaders that security matters? How do we tell them that they should invest in us, in people with our skills, in the tooling and techniques that will actually make them more secure? Ideally, the things that really work, not just the stuff that a lot of companies like to buy because it's stuff. So the short answer to that is to look at peer organizations. Who are the companies that do similar things to your company, and what has happened to them? What has happened when they have a bad day? And one of the really powerful things you can do when you do that is look at what that incident cost them. Talk in terms of dollars, because companies understand dollars significantly better than they do weird terms about security postures and stuff like that. And so that is the goal of this talk, to help you explain to your leadership how to talk in dollars and understand what are the things that cost more money than some other things. So where do incident costs come from? I found a couple of broad categories in talking with the claims personnel in my organization. And the first is what you normally think of when you're talking about incidents, the direct incident cost. The things that the organization does to immediately get out of that incident. So if you think about your stop the bleeding activities, immediately patch the server, take it offline, rebuild, those sorts of things. You might hire some professionals, an incident response firm, to come in and help your organization with that incident. There might be a ransom payment and the fees that go along with that. Cryptocurrency conversion fees, working with a professional negotiator, which I highly recommend not doing this on your own. They can save you a lot of money. And network asset loss, because sometimes the damage is so much that you can't really recover from that, and so it is more cost effective to procure new equipment than to recover your old equipment. There's also some other required incident costs that may go along with that. So think of your compliance type activities. If sensitive personal data was leaked, there might be notification of regulatory bodies. There might be notification to individuals that have been affected. Now, in order to figure out who has been affected, first you have to do a whole bunch of data mining. And that can be much longer and slower than you expect, because how many organizations have very well labeled data and understand what is sensitive data and what is not sensitive data? Such an encouraging answer. And then take that further, how many of them have all of that data stored in nice, tidy databases? How many of you have tripped over sensitive data that is a scanned-in document that was originally handwritten? There's quite a few hands up in the audience. And so all of that takes time, all of that takes money. And so the data mining alone can cause costs to go up, but then there's the notification as well. If an organization is doing notification by mail of American citizens, let's say it's an American company, American PII has been breached, they have to notify American residents, you can expect notification alone to cost about $1 per person. So consider if you're an organization that has data on a lot of people, how much does notification cost you? A lot. And so that is something to consider when you're talking with your organizational leadership on, does that math work out? Is your potential liability of a data breach more than the revenue you bring in? Interesting question. And then along with the notification itself, frequently there is credit monitoring, which also brings along a cost. Something that I sort of thought about, but hadn't really thought about a ton, is the cost of business interruption. Now, from insurance's perspective, we tend to think in terms of lost profit. Organizations tend to think in terms of lost revenue. How do we balance those two concepts? That is where the fun and exciting field of forensic accounting comes in. Talking about that would be an entire other talk, and I would love to introduce you to some of what they do. It is actually really interesting, I promise you. Not that I want to do it, but it's good to learn about. But it means there is some very interesting math that goes on in the back end. And part of that involves understanding that for most organizations, there's a sliding scale of down. There's not up and there's down. There's, well, this system works, this system is degraded, this one needs to be completely rebuilt, so on and so forth. And so understanding all of that takes a lot of work. And the really big thing here is understanding just how long a business interruption takes. A short ransomware incident can take about 3 weeks. That's a short one. More often, recovery takes months. And we've seen, especially with a couple of recent libraries, can take over a year to get all of their services back up and running. Another interesting concept is contingent BI or dependent BI, BI being business interruption. It's when one of your suppliers has been hit. And so that's something to think about as well. All of your systems might be good, but if someone you rely on has an incident, can you keep operating? There are also, separate from those compliancy costs that I talked about, kind of regulatory-ish costs. So consider if there is a legal or regulatory investigation into what you do. Well, that's going to take people off mission, so that's going to cost you all some money there. If there are any required legal settlements, that is, of course, going to cost money. There may be fines, penalties, other things of that nature. All of that costs your organization money, and it might take several years for those costs to realize because investigations take time. There's reputational costs. These are really difficult to quantify, not generally covered by insurance, and at the end of the day, organizations that are transparent tend to retain their customer trust a lot more than organizations that are like, oh no, nothing to see here, everything's perfect. The ones who are honest with us, we respect that, right? And there's also what we refer to as betterment within insurance. And those are a lot of times long-term upgrades. They might be things that are required by those legal settlements from a couple of slides ago. And again, not generally covered by insurance. So stop the bleeding, probably covered by your insurance. Complete overhaul of your system, you're on your own. You're going to need to invest your organization's dollars to do that. So what affects each of these costs? So this is really the important part, the things you can take back to your organizations on how they can save money. on those direct incident costs, that incident response, look, complex networks suck to do incident response in. They suck a lot. And so being able to simplify your network as much as possible, to segment, to limit the spread of any incident is going to make that so much easier for those incident responders. So they can do their jobs a lot easier. And most of us have probably run into the well-meaning IT staff that are like, oh no, I can handle this. Unless they've specifically had incident response training, probably not quite so much. You know, we've all run into that well-meaning IT person that is like, oh, this computer was acting weird, so I reformatted it so the user can get back to work. And that was patient 0. And fun fact, ransom actors sometimes know what your insurance coverage is because amongst the rest of your organization's documents are your insurance policies. And so they can use that as bargaining chips. Yay! However, sometimes they don't know the difference between like cyber insurance and property casualty and MPL and E&O, and so the negotiators end up giving them a class and say, no, they're not actually covered for this. Insurance isn't magically going to pay that many dollars. Nice try. But I do, again, still highly recommend hiring professional negotiators because they understand how to get those actors to behave as well as possible. And the big one here is really, are your backups ransomware resistant? And what that looks like is going to be a little bit different for each organization. Obviously, completely offline is great, but good segmentation, other things like that can help with that. But understanding, if your entire network is taken out, can you actually rebuild it? Really? Those compliance costs, look, data is nuclear waste. The more data you have on hand, the more liability you have. And while I am not a lawyer, I am pretty sure some of them in the audience would throw around terms like discoverability, things like that. And so it really comes down to your data governance. Keeping what you have to, destroying what you don't have to keep, and labeling everything possible. And labeling data into the past is really hard. Labeling everything from here on out, that's usually achievable. That's a good place to start. But the obligatory pithy saying, what you collect, you must protect. Data is hard. Business interruption, it really all comes down to minimizing downtime. Again, it's understanding where your backups are stored, actually practicing restoring backups. Have the required firms on retainer, especially if you need some sort of specialty incident response firm. Like someone who's familiar with dealing with medical equipment or manufacturing equipment, because those sorts of firms, the one who can do that well, they have limited capacity. And so they're going to take care of their customers who are actually on retainer before they take care of everybody else. Highly recommend having an incident response plan that exists on paper. And ideally, I mean literal paper, so that when your entire network explodes, you still have a list of phone numbers and contacts and something to get you started. Practice, practice, practice. Absolutely practice every step of your incident response plan. And whatever your critical processes are, be able to run manually, be able to run on paper. If it requires that a form is printed out, have a stash of them somewhere. Whatever you need to do to run without your network until you can get your network up, have that system already in place. Regulatory costs, I am not a lawyer, but a lot of this really comes down to proving that you took due care. That's not always that you did the minimum compliance task, but it's that, no, you actually had the people who knew what they were doing and did right every step of the way. Reputational costs, again, this is hard, but have a plan. Understand if you have an incident, what are you going to communicate? How are you going to communicate that? And crisis communications is a legitimate profession, and crisis communicators are going to be able to walk you through this a lot better than your average, marketing or public affairs professional. So, in conclusion, if I were going to emphasize 3 points, 1, minimize your data to the absolute minimum that you need to maintain regulatory compliance and be able to run your business. Have a plan and practice, practice, practice. Absolutely practice every step of that plan to the maximum possible. And of course, there are the obligatory ways to get in contact with me. We might actually have like 2 minutes for a question. All right, thank you very much. If you have anything you'd like to take offline, I will be around and around the rest of the weekend. Have fun.